Good day to you. I think we can all agree that one of the basic, simple, but still really great pleasures in life is taking a warm shower. Isn't that a great feeling, especially when you're feeling really, really gruffy, feel like you really need to get a good cleaning, or maybe you want to warm up in this kind of weather? It's nice to get in a hot shower, but as you step into that tub or that shower stall, it becomes all important that you know what you're doing when you're touching that cold and you're touching that hot tap, because one wrong move and you can be scalded. One wrong move the other direction, and you're in for a rude surprise because it's so frozen, it's waking you up with a big shock. What you are doing is you are regulating the temperature of that water to derive your pleasure. And if you regulate it the wrong way, you end up burned or you end up frozen. And that's the way that I want to introduce the material for today, because today we're talking about regulation of media. It's actually my favorite subject to talk about when we compare media from around the world. It's not necessarily the most exciting, but when I was going around the world to these 6 countries that I visited, and later I visited China after I wrote the book that's generating the material that you're reading online. When I was going around the world, I was often meeting with government regulators. I was meeting with government regulators in Paris, France. I was meeting with government regulators in Accra, Ghana. I was meeting with government regulators in London, in Mexico City, and all across the country. So I gained really good insight, I believe, into the regulatory process. And that actually is one of the reasons that I was hired as a consultant for the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, and then later the U.S. Consulate in Ciudad Juarez, or Juarez City, Mexico as well, was to be a workshop consultant for journalists to tell them what they could do based on media regulations. So let's talk about how we can apply that subject to comparative media in our class taking place this semester. And we'll start out with a statement that's made in the chapter as well, or the readings, I should say. And that is that media are regulated across the world. Yeah, there is no place that media are not regulated. And the reason for that is because media have a lot of power, right? And so media are regulated to try and control media, to try and prevent media from providing certain content, but also to require media to provide certain content, and in between, to encourage media to provide certain content. We're going to be talking about those content types today. They can be in the areas of violence, for example. Do we want to control violence? Do we want to make sure that it's not too harsh, especially when children are around? Then there's sexual content, another big area of regulation. What is the view towards sex and sexuality and profanity? All of those things are jumbled together. And then we have the idea of imported media content. Earlier in the class, we talked about how smaller countries in the democratic, participant, and developmental philosophy mold, they are often vulnerable from outside influences, and so sometimes imported media content needs to be controlled, otherwise your country is taken over by another country. We call that cultural imperialism, remember? And then there's educational content, and sometimes you see educational content more prevalent in certain countries than others because it's actually required. So let's get at more details behind the regulatory process. Remember, media are controlled. They don't just grow up. They start because of cultural characteristics in a country set within a globalization context. And out of that are growing philosophies, ways of thinking about what functions media should perform for a particular society based on that society's unique conditions. And out of that now is growing the idea of regulations that is specifically codifying how we can get media to obey or follow certain rules, which are known as regulations. And we want to say then that regulation basically means influences. It's any entity that can influence media operations and media content. And we'll start with the most commonly known category of this kind of influence, and that is the government-related agency. Important phrasing there, the government-related agency, because there is always a criticism, and I shouldn't say always, but often a criticism, that if a government is running a media property, whether it's a television station or a website or a newspaper, that government is going to be prone to controlling that for the government's benefit. And all kinds of bad things will have to happen after that, like corruption. And so government-related regulatory agencies is a way of saying the government will set up the structure of how the organization is going to operate, how people are voted in, for example, the jurisdiction, how that entity ties in with law, constitutional law, if a country has constitutional law. All of that is set up by the government, but the agency is actually independent. It runs independent. It doesn't theoretically take orders from any government official, any politician. It's operating independently. Best example of that is the FCC in the United States, the Federal Communications Commission. France has a similar entity, the Conseil. I can't remember the name of it, but the acronym is CSE. And in London, or in England, you have a super regulator called Ofcom, or the Office of Communication, which is a super regulator because it has its fingers in many different areas of determining content, as well as approving licenses to start up media companies and all kinds of other areas. So government-related agencies are kind of seen as sort of the safe way to regulate media. It's not susceptible to outside influences, but as we know, everybody is susceptible to influences when money and corruption and political favors get involved. At least I hope we all know that. Which takes us to the second kind of regulatory influence in media, and that's going to be the government itself. Sometimes government just flat out owns media or directs media. We've talked about that under an authoritarian philosophical system, under a communist philosophical system. For sure in China, you cannot be a Western media and a Western media property owned by a Western media company in China. You can only be a Chinese media company, which is not the same for Lebanon. If you go to Lebanon, you can actually find French radio and BBC radio. These are government operated radio stations that are actually housed within Lebanon. They're not being imported. They're actually housed on the site in the country of Lebanon. So government does have to do with that direct regulation. It's not always from the point of view that the government is going to be controlling the media and making it a propaganda arm to get its word out. Sometimes in the case of Chinese media, even though it's communist, and even though we've established that there's an intolerance for political opposition, sometimes the regulation is simply to make sure that television is programming Chinese operas. The melody opera, one of the most famous forms of storytelling in the history of civilization, done through operatic, cinematic, and vocal expressions. So we have those two. They're kind of related, government related, and government are related to each other. Yeah, too many double words there. Next up is citizen groups. Citizen groups can take matters into their own hands. They join together. Theoretically, they're not going to be governed by any particular financial interest, though they may have an ideology. It may be religious-based, for example. There is an organization in the United States. It's called the Parents Television Council, or PTC. They have a website, and basically they serve as a kind of a moral steering ground from their point of view for how television content should be. And if you feel that television content is offensive, you can write into them, you can file a complaint. They even provide a direct link to complain to the FCC. An example of content that they were opposed to at one point during their existence was unnecessary cosmetic surgery being shown on television. Their position was, if you're a burn victim and you need a skin graft, that's one thing. If you're not happy with your nose, that's quite something else. And to have that kind of cosmetic surgery glorified on television would be encouraging people to be dissatisfied, which many people already are, with the way that they look. It's only enhancing the frailties of the human condition. So there's an example of how a citizen group is banding together, no major financing, they raise donations, and they are applying influence on the media. Next up is audiences. The audiences, especially within a private profit-making model, are very, very important as an influence. If people are not watching the TV show, if people are not accessing the web page and purchasing things on the web page, if people are not reading the newspaper, which they're not these days, if people are not listening to the radio station, then that station, that newspaper, that web page, that TV station, they're going to change content. They may change formats. They may go out of business. That's because of the capital model within the libertarian private profit-making structure is having media operating to make a profit. Most media in the United States are profit-making media, over 90%. You have only to go through the TV channel. How many of those stations are running commercials? Same with radio. Sometimes it's impossible to avoid a commercial. Open a newspaper, ads right there. Web pages, pop-ups all the time. So our culture is very advertising based, and by the way, that's not the same around the world, not the same around there. Take a country like Sweden, we've highlighted that before, or even Australia, you find less advertising, less profit making because there's more public media, more media that are drawing money from other sources than just advertising. We'll identify that when we get to our next chapter on financing or our next section on financing. But right now we're sticking with regulation. We're talking about how audiences will regulate a program. And we even have that directly happening with interactivity, right? We have people who can call in to Dancing with the Stars and they can vote somebody off the program live as it is happening. So we have these kinds of interactions because of the internet between a TV audience and certainly between people and web pages. You're clicking through is giving data all the time. So audiences, big influence on media content. Next up is advertisers. Advertisers is not often fully understood the extent to which advertisers influence media content. Everybody may think, oh yeah, sure, we know that an advertiser buys a product and then you see in this TV show, there's going to be a Nike ad. You're watching the Super Bowl, there's going to be an ad for Budweiser. You're going to the store, there's going to be a billboard on the way, on the highway. It's just part of our landscape. You're going to go on the web and you're going to have to enter your some kind of password somewhere along the way, and then you're going to get a banner ad in your Facebook. You're going to get an ad that shows up in your news feed on any social media platform that you have. It's going to be coming after you. Advertising is much more than that, though, in terms of influence. Advertising has a kind of a wink and a nod relationship with media producers. And what I mean by that is if you're the Disney company, which happens to own ABC News, and let's say you have a very, very sad accident that happens at a Disney World theme park where somebody is killed or hurt, seriously, perhaps falling off of a roller coaster ride. We don't want that to happen, but I'm trying to give you a good illustration here. Do you think that that's going to be covered by ABC News? Maybe, if it gets out and everybody else is covering it, but how many of those incidents might already have been buried because it's not in ABC News's interest? That's an example of the wink and the nod advertising influence. And similarly, if you're raking in lots of advertising dollars from Verizon and you're a television show or you're a web page and you have that Verizon logo because they're doing a 2-for-1 sale, the last thing that you're going to be doing is, if you're a sitcom, is making fun of how cell phone companies are taking away from people's humanity because people are stuck on their phones all the time and have a real hard time discussing things with each other. There's another example of advertising, the wink and the nod. We're not going to carry anything negative about Verizon on our webpage. It's just understood. It's not like the advertisers calling you up and saying, hey, you do this, we're pulling our account. That's not the way it goes. It's kind of like it's understood. So advertising has as big an influence on media content in many ways as regulation. It is as government regulation or government related regulation. It's just less able to be seen. It's more clandestine, more covert, the influence of advertising on media content, which takes us to the last regulatory body, regulatory influence, and that is the media organizations themselves. Those media organizations impose regulations all the time. You won't actually really know how many suicides are taking place in your local area if you're just listening to radio. And that's because there is a long-standing tradition in the radio industry not to broadcast suicides, especially ones that are amongst young people. The thinking is if family members don't know, this is not the way for them to find out. And secondly, there can be a domino effect. Young people are very vulnerable, their hormones are raging. If they see it happening and it becomes normalized, it may become a more viable option to them, is the thinking behind radio stations. And yet there's plenty of a counter argument to that regulation, that self-regulation, I should say, based on things like, well, if people don't know there's a problem, then how are we going to address it? In order to know that there's a problem, we have to hear that problem reported. It's just another way of thinking. But it's pointing out that media organizations themselves will regulate, and often under a social responsibility system, that's what's expected. Because the government's going to get out there with a bully pulpit and saying, we're seeing too much drug use on nighttime television, or we're seeing too much teen pregnancy being regulated, being presented in a positive way. So we're going to get in there and we're going to pass some laws unless you media organizations clean up your act, unless you self-regulate. All right, now that we've wrapped up the main regulatory influences, let's go on to making a distinction between broadcast media and print media. Broadcast media do have a history of being regulated more than print media. It's based on a very esoteric argument that still exists called the scarcity of spectrum space argument. And basically, it's the idea that when you broadcast, which is sending your signal over the air, you are using a piece of the radio band. It's a piece of the FM radio band, or it's a piece of the AM radio band. And that band has finite places for radio stations. like WESS, the university's radio station here at East Stroudsburg University, which I advise, has 90.3 assigned to it, 90.3 FM. Another station can't come in and do 90.4. There would be interference with our station because of the way that the radio band works. So there's only so many places on that band. Because of that, broadcasters were said to have a heightened position in life, a special position, that they have access because of that bandwidth to thousands or even millions of people, which allows them to generate massive amounts of advertising revenue and also to have a powerful impact on the people who are receiving the message, whether it's during elections or during war campaigns. Mass media have a privileged position because of that spectrum space. So because of it, they need to be watched closely. They need to be made sure that they're not drumming up propaganda for a particular political candidate just because that candidate has a lot of money. So yeah, this is kind of relevant to today's races, right? Or that candidate is able to control a media organization by virtue of enforcing through regulatory laws such as the equal time provision, which is already on our books, that if you interview a person of one political persuasion during an election who's running for office, you have to interview the person running from the other side, an opposing candidate, and you have to offer that same time frame. But what happens if the opposing candidate has very little support among the people and does not seem to be running a serious campaign? All of a sudden, they're elevated by that law to equal status. So broadcast media have these kinds of restrictions that print media don't. Print media have been seen to be free. It's very easy you can bring all the newspapers you want in the world, and I can fit them all in my office just about. Probably can. If you have one of every different newspaper in the world, I would guess. And so there is not that kind of finite space for print, and that's why print has not been as regulated as much. However, print self-regulates itself. You won't see a newspaper using profanity very often, if at all. That's not because it's a law, it's because newspapers are self-regulating. Why? Because advertisers in the papers, they don't want their stories associated with filth or dirtiness. So we're back to advertisers with that example. But the point being that broadcast media are much more regulated. However, broadcast media have been the grip of regulation has been loosened on broadcast media as the internet has come onto the scene and presented even more electronic choices, so that the big companies from the past, the Disneys, the Foxes, they don't have as much potential clout as they had before, but there are still restrictions in place for broadcast media that are not there for print media. And our final idea for today is to point out that the European Union, that body of government oversight that Britain has just withdrawn from through Brexit, right? The EU itself has an umbrella of regulations that it expects all member countries to follow. And one of those, for example, is called a minutage regulation. Minutes, that's the basis of that term, minutage, meaning that in certain countries, France, Sweden, the UK, you are only allowed to broadcast so many minutes of ads per hour. In the case of Sweden, it's very strict, 6 minutes, period. Now here in the US, you can watch a half hour of TV and 18 minutes can be ads and 22 minutes can be the program. So think about that. You're watching for a half an hour, but you're really only getting 22 minutes of content. And in the case of news, you're getting news that's shrunk, right? If it's a news program, 22 minutes when it could be longer, 18 minutes. Yeah, 18 minutes. No, 12 minutes. You know what I'm saying. 18. My math's not kind of screwed up right now. But compared to 6 minutes per hour, that's what minutiae is all about. The EU also has very strong regulations when it comes to children. And in fact, in Sweden, which this is not an EU regulation, but it's an outgrowth of the idea of how to regulate really hard so that children are protected. In Sweden, it is illegal to not only target children with advertising, but to use a child in an ad. Now, I don't know if you recall the E-Trade commercials in U.S. television. They were running for quite a while, where you have two babies with adult voices superimposed. Totally illegal in Sweden. Kids are too young to know whether that's good for them. They are vulnerable little human beings. To use them in commercials is exploiting them. It is getting them to do things that will have an impact on their lives that they have not yet had a chance to make a decision about themselves. Do you know many child actors in Hollywood that are very, very happy with their lives today, who haven't been through really traumatic circumstances like a Justin Bieber? That's what this law is designed to prevent. And the EU has general regulations as well, as does the US, by the way. The US has a regulation by the FCC that children have to have children's television programming that is not just cartoons, it's educational on the weekends. So there you have it. We've just rolled out the idea of regulation. And as you take that on today and you're studying your country, try and get at the regulations that cover the widest range of media that you can, the broadcast media, the print media, and the internet media. See if you can get all of that into your post on your country media post for today. Have a great day.